There is zero chance for terrorist financing or illicit financing to occur without the government's knowledge. I mean, Turkey's intelligence capabilities, illicit finance monitoring capabilities are not infantile. They very much have the capability. So I would say it's definitely with the blessing of the Turkish government. I have seen a study that identifies approximately 30 Turkish-owned charities operating in Israel, across Israel. Right. And these 30 that I've seen, just these 30, all have ties to illicit terrorism financing. Turkey is the single biggest financing node for Hamas's operations inside of Gaza in the world.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Sinan Ciddi, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Director of FDD's Turkey program. Sinan has spent more than 2 decades studying Turkish domestic politics and foreign policy. He's also an associate professor of national security studies at Marine Corps University and teaches at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And this conversation comes at an extraordinary moment. Israel and Turkey are now confronting each other over Syria. Ankara maintains deep ties with Hamas. Turkey has entered a new defense alignment with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and President Erdogan is expanding Turkish military, political, and economic influence across the region. So today, I want to understand where this confrontation is heading and ask a much bigger question. Is Erdogan transforming Turkey from a difficult NATO ally into Israel's next major strategic adversary? Sinan, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This is quite an extraordinary time.
Truly. Sinan, you recently said Israel and Turkey are very close to a significant escalation. After Israel's strike on the Abu al-Daghur air base in Syria, is this exactly what you were warning about?
I think it's one of the sort of nodes that helps me sort of put that perspective out there. I just saw this morning that the Israeli government's spokesman, or the spokesman for the Israeli prime minister, put out an official video analyzing this strike of this airbase in northwestern Syria near Aleppo. And to my knowledge, this is the first time that the state of Israel has referred to Turkey as an enemy state. And that's quite a significant development. That's not just, people may just assume, yeah, but I mean, the Netanyahu government in Israel considers Turkey an enemy. That may be in sort of the vernacular, but as an official statement, that is something that Israel has really resisted very hard in using as a term to define Turkey, because Turkey is a significant and major NATO ally of the United States. And certainly, I would say, the most significant contributing country to NATO outside of the United States. And Israel has shied away from essentially determining Turkey as an enemy state. But at this point, I think, they're not holding their punches anymore, simply because the Turks under Erdogan are not essentially stopping this process of escalation. We've seen this sort of back and forth. I've seen on social media, in the mainstream press, both broadcast and digital, saying, well, the Israelis are escalating and the Israelis want a weak Syria. They want to trample upon the whole region. They're really raising tensions against Turkey. I think that is a misnomer, right? And I really think people should take a step back and stop with what I would refer to as their Israel derangement syndrome for a while and just say, take a look at the Turkey file, right? Turkey's activities and escalatory moves towards Israel is not new. It did not start yesterday. It did not start last week, last year, or just after October 7. It started back in 2008. Erdogan, since 2008, systematically has done everything to isolate, undermine, and delegitimize Israel in the minds of Turks. And this is not coincidental. It's not just something he woke up to, but this has been a long dream of his, going back to his earliest days as a politician, when he was nurtured in Turkey's political Islamist movement. He just does not have an interest in maintaining robust or even cordial ties with the Israelis. What he has in mind is a means to undermine, isolate, and see, in my opinion, a meaningful destruction of the state of Israel, such that he is able to dominate a significant amount of political or geostrategic real estate in the region.
Now, Israel says that Syria was preparing to allow a significant Turkish military presence at Abu al-Dahur. Turkey and Syria obviously dispute that account, but what do you believe Turkey was actually planning to do there, and how is Turkey using Syria for their own motives?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually don't know yet because we've had no official statement in terms of what specifically the Turks were intending to do with that airbase. Were they seeking to put Turkish warplanes in there as they had been proposing to do in another airbase which the Israelis bombed back in 2025, which it was in the middle of Syria or close to the middle of Syria, the Palmyra and T4 air bases, where the Turks were thinking of positioning F-16 fighters, which the Israelis basically said doesn't work for us. But in this case, we actually don't know what they were going to position. And my suspicion is, I don't have hard evidence for this, but my speculation is whatever the Turks were going to put in there, whether it was sensitive military equipment, which is what Axios reported, whether it was intelligence capabilities, significant munitions, I don't know what it was. My speculation is that it was disturbing enough for the Israelis and embarrassing enough for the Turks not to disclose. Because the Turks would not want their dirty laundry aired in saying this is what the Turks were being willing to position there. And the Israelis are not going to reveal sources and methods as to what they destroyed and why they destroyed it. And essentially, we just left it with guesswork. But I would underline this. The Israelis and the Syrians reached an accommodation and understanding that the Syrian government would not permit any military buildup inside of Syria, which was going to be perceived as a military threat to Syria. They warned the Syrians, saying, "Please don't allow the Turks to do and install whatever they are proposing to put in this base." But they obviously didn't listen. And at this point, the Israelis are just saying, "Well, look, we had an agreement. We've communicated this to the Syrian government. We tried to communicate it to the Turkish government. Everybody proceeded anyway, and for that, what's left to us is to essentially take action because they're not listening, and we're just not going to countenance a significant military capability buildup inside of Syria, which could be used against us in the future." And that's the Israeli position, and the Turks don't want to listen to it.
So, like you said, Israel established a very clear red line. Do you think Erdogan was trying to test Israel to see whether they would actually enforce that red line?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, look, the Turks, are right now on this sort of media blitz and narrative, and this is where the Israeli side is really sort of, unfortunately, on a backpedal. They're having trouble countering this narrative that the Turks are putting out. Saying what the Turkish narrative is saying is, look, the Netanyahu government bombed this airstrip in a bid to escalate tensions with Turkey, simply because Netanyahu is running for re-election in October. And he needs something to essentially fearmonger and scare Israelis at home to say, look, there's a big bad boogeyman, and that's why he did it. And the other reason what they cite is that the Israelis are not interested in having stable and strong state neighbors around them. They want to have sort of weaker and dismembered sort of state entities so that Israel can dominate the region. I don't think that's true either. But the biggest line that they seem to have jumped on the Turks, which is resonating, unfortunately, with audiences, saying, regardless of what anyone thinks, the Turkish government and the Turkish military have been invited into Syria to conduct training, assistance, reconstruction efforts of the Syrian military, whereas the Israelis have not. Okay. That happens to be actually true on paper. That's fundamentally true. I mean, the Syrians are uncomfortable with the Israeli military presence inside their borders. I would say two things. One is the Syrians are not exactly too jazzed about having the Turkish military do whatever they want and have undue influence inside of Syria. We know this because Syrian social media channels, personalities are very much active saying, we have this partnership with the Turks, but all they seem to be doing is landing us in trouble with the Israelis, which then ends up in some sort of military strike against our territory. And we need to limit Turkish influence inside of Syria. There is that narrative that's been. The second biggest one is which is where I call Turkish hypocrisy out, is, well, the Turks didn't wait for permission from the Syrian government during the civil war to militarily invade the country 3 times in 3 major military offensives inside of Syria, citing terrorism concerns emanating out of there. And they certainly didn't ask the permission of the then Syria government under Assad to occupy significant parts of northwestern Syria, which they still do. So the narrative seems to be If the Turks say, well, I have national security concerns, then I can go into Syria when and in a fashion that I deem fit. But the Israelis can never do that. That just doesn't seem to me reasonable to me.
Let's say the next Israeli strike kills Turkish soldiers. What does Erdogan do? Could he politically afford to absorb Turkish military casualties caused by Israel without retaliating?
Yeah, look, this is where it becomes really problematic. I think since the strike on that airbase a few days ago, I have not heard Erdogan say anything significant. I mean, and I think he's going to come out and say something. And when it does, it's going to be harsh and verbally sort of, a verbal diatribe. If there is more heated exchange or exchanges of this kind in terms of what we just saw in the airbase, but instead, as you suggest, we have Turkish casualties, then I think the gloves come off. Erdogan, whether he wants to do it or not, engage in military escalation, armed conflict with the Israelis, he will be under tremendous public pressure at this point to act militarily against Israel. But that is a pressure point that he has built up, right? I would also say, when people say, well, the Israelis have just been as escalatory in heated rhetoric against Turkey as the Turks, I was like, at this point, I'm like, well, that's fine. That's an opinion you have. But please understand this. The Israelis since October 7, have been trying very hard to sort of understand how a man such as Erdogan can never take ownership of his sort of vile rhetoric that's also anti-Western, not just anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic, but it also has been consistently anti-Western for over a decade, right? And he's been driving a narrative that calls for the destruction of Israel. He's called for essentially the rising up of Muslim countries to essentially, take down Israel, and wants to spearhead, I would argue, a sort of messianic cause to really sort of underwrite the jihadist dream of eliminating the state of Israel. And he's referred to this, Israelis as genocidal. He's referred to the Israeli government as Nazi-esque, right? And the Israelis, since in each of these sort of exchanges, have been remarkably measured. And if that's just a rhetorical part. There is also Turkey being the single biggest benefactor of Hamas outside of Gaza since the weakening of Iran, but particularly since October 7th, right? We have, Hamas institutionalized inside of Turkey. They have government cover. They have citizenship in leadership roles. They have the major and lion's share of financing that comes to Hamas's operating accounts originating Turkey, going to Hamas in Gaza. This is not a benign actor, right? Erdogan has built up this sort of public opinion inside of Turkey as Israel as a demon sort of entity, and he has invested a considerable amount of time and energy in making sure that if anybody, if there's a skirmish in which Turks are killed, which I would argue he would escalate, then there'll be immense public pressure in Turkey to attack Israel in return.
Now, many people assume that Erdogan's confrontation with Israel is primarily about Gaza. You mentioned that you could trace it back to 2008, 2009. If the Gaza conflict disappeared tomorrow, for example, would Erdogan's attitude towards Israel change, or is he just using Gaza as an excuse?
I would argue the latter. I mean, Erdogan is in the business of essentially really spreading Turkey's geopolitical influence as the major power. If you listen to Erdogan in any of his public speeches in the last 2 years, what he uses are terms such as, positioning Turkey as, quote, a global actor. He's not actually pretending or, just, throwing random words out there. What people have to realize is since 2022, Erdogan has significantly focused to mend ties with the Arab world, which he spent a decade basically ripping apart. That means the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Qataris, now the Libyans, right? And he's spent an enormous amount of time and energy rebuilding those ties. And we've just seen the signing of the Mecca Pact, which is intended to be a security alliance between the three major Muslim powers with economic and military capabilities. Since the beginning of the Iran war, regardless of whether the regime in Iran is toppled or whether it exists in a limping form, Erdogan has essentially said this is our moment to essentially take the mantle of geostrategic power in the region. And that has to come at the expense of Israel. And what we're seeing is if the regime is weakened in Tehran to the extent that it is now, Turkey continues to support Hamas. We are hearing that the Turks are interested and are potentially supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. because those are proxy entities which are notionally owned by Iran, but now entities which Turkey is significantly backing. Right? The fact that if the war ends tomorrow, Erdogan's not going anywhere. He is in the business of projecting Turkish power on a global scale. I would say one thing: people should not look at Turkey's activities as, well, Turkey's fixation on Israel or the Middle East. This is a global and regional project which he has invoked. We are starting work to analyze Turkey's military, educational, commercial, and economic footprint on the continent of Africa. Turkey has diplomatic missions in over 40 countries in Africa. It has private military contractors providing military training and assistance to significant military entities in the Sahel. They're selling them weapons, drones. The other thing that they're doing, they've spent in one instance with one private foundation, just one, $1 billion, which has resulting in the opening of 160 plus schools across different states, with 8,000 teachers in air quotes. And if you ask what that's intended to do, that is a grooming operation across the continent of Africa, which sows anti-Semitism, anti-Westernism, and it is intended as an investment that outlasts any single one government in those African states. Turkey's been in Africa for the past 11 years. Since 2011. Turkey's military buildup, Turkey right now is manufacturing more warships in its shipyards than the combined efforts of the United States and Europe. Right now, there are 60 warships, mostly intended for the Turkish Navy, that are building, including one aircraft carrier. So I would just caution viewers and listeners that what's going on is not just a Middle East focused problem. And what separates Turkey from any other power, or mainly from the Iranian threat that we've come to sort of focus on and fixate on, is something that my colleague here at FDD says: Turkey is not a trash state, right? It's not a basket case economy or a basket case political entity like Iran. And Iran is worrying enough. You're looking at an economy which is a $1.7 trillion economy, which is approximately twice the size of Israel's. It has a world-class military that has been tasked to have global ambitions. It has NATO membership, it has the backing of the Trump government, and it has significant buy-in and support from the European Union. This is a major problem that the West is not poised to understand or essentially position itself against, because we're all asleep at the wheel.
Now, you mentioned that there are Hamas-linked networks operating from Turkey. Could networks this extensive operate inside Turkey without Turkish intelligence knowing about them? And if they do know about them, are they unable to shut them down or unwilling to shut them down?
Two great questions. There is zero chance in Turkey being able to, for terrorist financing or illicit financing to occur without the government's knowledge. I mean, Turkey's intelligence capabilities, illicit finance monitoring capabilities are not infantile. They very much have the capability. So I would say it's definitely with the blessing of the Turkish government. Right now, it is fair to say there are approximately, I have seen a study that identifies approximately 30 Turkish-owned charities operating in Israel, across Israel. Right. And these 30 that I've seen, just these 30, all have ties to illicit terrorism financing. And these financing operations include and have ties to Turkish banks, both public and private. But they also have correspondent bank relationships with entities in the United States. This is something that we're very curious and very worried about, and hoping to approach US decision makers, both in the Treasury Department and Foreign Assets Control, to essentially get at least get the US end of the correspondent banking relationship shut down. These are major problems, and Turkey has been a major facilitator of Hamas financing for the past 15 years, I would argue, unfettered and unhindered. And it's probably safe to assume, based on our work, that Turkey is the single biggest financing node for Hamas's operations inside of Gaza in the world. It is the major conduit in which world contributions to Hamas's operating accounts come through in a permissive environment through Turkey's financial system.
Speaking of Turkish intelligence, we know that recently there was a plot to assassinate President Trump in Turkey. Israel warned the US. Could have been possible for Turkish intelligence not to know about that plot as well? What is your personal opinion about that?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that it would be a personal opinion. It would be purely speculation on my part. I would think that the Turks have zero interest in having a U.S. president assassinated on their soil, and we saw that reporting that how the president was essentially able to switch planes, etc., etc. My guess is, and my hunch is, and I'm 80% confident, 90% confident in this, is that Turkish intelligence would share anything like that with their U.S. counterparts, because the assassination of a U.S. president on Turkish soil, if the Turks knew about it, would present significant challenges, both politically, diplomatically, for Turkey going forward. And we have to remember that the Turks have a very good relationship with the Trump administration. Erdogan and Trump are very, very close and very, very tight, as we know. Trump refers to him as my friend. And so I'm still, I am fairly confident that the Turks would not hold anything back in intelligence sharing. And I think I've seen some reporting to suggest that they were aware of this and shared it with their American counterparts.
Okay. Now, Israeli security officials have alleged that the Hamas operatives in Turkey have helped directly activity in the West Bank. Has Turkey crossed from, political sanctuary into an operational sanctuary? Could the people sitting in Istanbul actually be helping recruit operatives, move funds, and create direct attacks against Israelis in Israel?
But this has been going on for years. This is not new. And Israeli intelligence has been very forthright and very forthcoming with this drip information. Like every time we see a terror plot foiled inside of Israel or intended to be unleashed in the West Bank, right? And they detail the extent to which these operations which they foil originated in Turkey, had Turkish financial backing, that some of the operatives were recruited in Turkey, and because Hamas has two operating bases inside of Turkey. One is a financial fundraising arm, as in like that is the crew, the office space, which essentially diverts and channels international financing that Hamas receives into the operating accounts of Gaza by basically laundering this money. But the other office is commonly referred to as the West Bank Group. And a lot of the people who lead that office are some of the worst offenders of terrorist activities against Israel, who were convicted and imprisoned, but were part of a prisoner exchange operation in 2011 for the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap. About 1,000 Hamas operatives were delivered to Turkey, and this was the sort of backbone of Hamas's most operationally dangerous and committed entities. We are still speculating that some of the masterminds of the October 7 attacks actually were positioned and residing in Turkey whilst plotting this event. So when, we have documented through analysis every time this happens, FTD is published consistently saying, here is yet another terrorism plot that the Israelis have unfoiled. And, for doubters of this, because there are plenty of doubters on this, when either the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Service, or Mossad actually sort of, releases information, I'm usually pleasantly surprised, because the information which they disclose usually identifies personalities, names, and the extent to which they were involved in recruiting terrorists and the shipment of weapons, and the actual details of some of the plans they were hoping to hatch that would have resulted in significant casualties inside of Israel. So, I just underscore this. These are not sort of recent things. The Turks have been doing this for years. And it is mind-blowing to me that European powers, or, the United States, which also designates Hamas as a terrorist entity, have not been more forceful with their Turkish counterpart or their ally on paper to take further actions against this. This is just, unconscionable.
Now, you've described Turkey as an operational base for the wider Muslim Brotherhood network. Does Erdogan use Muslim Brotherhood organizations as like an instrument of Turkish power and influence on other countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, look, the biggest node of Muslim Brotherhood support that Erdogan has inside of Turkey is for Hamas, the Palestinian offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? But historically, Turkey provided a significant amount of political support for the Egyptian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was affiliated with Mohammed Morsi. Going back to those early years in 2012, 2013, Erdogan gave his election campaign staff. He literally loaned that staff to the Morsi campaign to get Morsi elected in Egypt. And after obviously the Sisi government overthrew the Morsi government, Turkey voluntarily received thousands of Morsi operators and the Muslim Brotherhood operators and domiciled them in Turkey. Muslim Brotherhood TV channels and other broadcast entities were permitted to set up shop in Turkey. But, this is all part and parcel of the political Islam movement that Erdogan belongs to in Turkey, sort of admiring the Muslim Brotherhood, going all the way back to the 70s, even into the 1960s, right, as a major sort of instrument. Because we have to remember that before Erdogan became prime minister, even when he was a young guy as mayor of Istanbul, even before then, Turkey's Islamist movement, which respected and admired the Muslim Brotherhood as a sort of major regional sort of aspiring sort of Islamist entity, was desirous to remove Turkey from the European Union as an applicant country. They wanted to pull Turkey out of NATO. These guys had disdain and just loathing for the West. But when Erdogan became prime minister, I would say feigning sort of love for the West and Western sort of principles of democracy and human rights and engagement with the West. What he was interested in is essentially was currying favor with the West. But in practice, I would say he lost no love for the goals of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we remember during the Arab Spring uprisings, the Turkish government was 100% behind any sort of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated government that rose up after some of the dictators were overthrown. And that being said, this sort of accounts for why Turkey's relationship with Egypt really fell apart, because Erdogan literally referred to the Sisi government as murderers, and he would not essentially deal with them, except, he's just thought, well, I'm going to turn that page because I need to have a functional relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. So on a nominal level, the Turks have done, significant amount of work to disestablish the Egyptian branches of the Muslim Brotherhood because Turkey wants to mend ties with the Egyptians. But on the other hand, Turkey has held back nothing in supporting some of the most nefarious aspects of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated entities, especially Hamas, because that is their main inroad into delegitimizing Western supremacy and the rules-based order in the Middle East.
Now, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan have entered a collective defense agreement stating that an attack on one of them is an attack on all. If Turkey gets into a military confrontation with Israel, which you said may happen, what exactly have Saudi Arabia and Pakistan committed themselves to?
Probably nothing. I mean, on paper, we've seen an article. Look, the Egyptians and I would say, the Saudis and the Pakistanis can't usually agree upon the color of the sky. I have zero belief in the Muslims world's ability to sort of corral and come together in a NATO-like fashion. I have never seen in this history, with the brief exception of the attempt to create a pan-Arab state in the 1950s, with Nasser's attempt with Syria and Egypt. Look, there is just too many differences in geostrategic preferences. You look at the Saudis want the best of both worlds. They want to have their cake and eat it, right? They want to maintain a strong and robust relationship with the Trump administration, but broadly the United States, because that is their biggest benefactor in terms of defense procurement, maintaining Saudi's sort of image across the world as a major Arab power. That's 100% derived from their relationship with the United States. But they also want to essentially develop ties with the Muslim world because they think that the United States might not be interested in supporting their defense sort of needs, as we saw in the Iranian attacks against major Arab powers in the region. So the Saudis want to keep that relationship going. The Pakistanis essentially need to maintain good terms with the United States because, again, they're not a significant ally of the United States. In fact, I would not call them an ally, but, Pakistanis have a big worry with India. And given Trump's sort of waning relationship with India, I think the Pakistanis sense that they can actually have increased ties with the United States in this very moment. But the interesting thing is, in the event of a major armed conflict between Israel and Turkey, I think these two powers might want to sit that one out. I suspect simply because I think the big reason why this pact came together, rather than defense, I would argue, was as a means to essentially solidify their economic, commercial, and trade ties. This is yet another area that I spoke about earlier in terms of look at the bigger picture of Turkey's global ambitions. The Turks, Saudis, and the Pakistanis' biggest ambition is to create trade lines, commercial ties, and energy lines that are bypass and replace the Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, existing channels. And what you see is that the Turks have already signed, independent of the Mecca Pact, significant memorandum of understandings, such as resuscitating and rebuilding the Hijaz Railway, that would allow the shipment of presumably Chinese goods and services bypassing Israel through a rail corridor that goes up through Saudi Arabia, Syria, right, all the way through Turkey to Europe. We are seeing the Turks essentially build what's referred to as the Middle Corridor, or want to see the essential building of the Middle Corridor, which is a trade route that would originate in Central Asia, that would also include Pakistan, as a means to transport land-based goods, again from China, but presumably, through land corridors through Turkey, again bypassing Russia, Iran, even Israel, obviously, all the way to Europe. But also, these powers are also interested in energy lines, oil and natural gas, that again bypass and provide meaningful alternatives to existing proposals, mainly that, for example, the IMEC corridor that Israel is part of. So this is where they're sort of solidifying, I would say, relationship, as opposed to this being a massive defense pact that's comparable to NATO. We've seen nothing that sort of says, is there going to be any, you know, normalization of rules of engagement, military cooperation, intelligence sharing. None of that I've seen. I haven't even seen the script of the agreement. But it is not something that we should just throw away in the trash can and say, just because it may be defensively toothless, it doesn't mean that it's harmless. These countries have rising ambitions.
Now, I want to ask you one last question. Why does President Trump appear to place so much confidence in Erdogan? Does he misunderstand Erdogan's ambitions, or is he kind of looking aside from that and choosing not to focus on Erdogan's ambitions?
This is a great question. I saw a clipping in the Israeli press the other week saying, I don't understand what they mean by when Trump says, I have a great relationship and with Erdogan, he's a great friend. I mean, Erdogan doesn't golf, he doesn't womanize, and he doesn't, he doesn't drink. So what is what is the basis of this relationship? And you know what? I have zero idea. Right? Look, another way of asking this is that, when people are frustrated with the Trump administration's perception of Turkey, which I share, and say, well, what can we do to essentially hold Turkey accountable, given that it's, a worrying state? And I was like, my answer is this, like, look, I'm not a magician, and, we have already had significant wins against Erdogan's transgressions, and Trump is choosing to walk away from them. Take the case of Halkbank. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with Halkbank, they should be. Why? Halkbank is a Turkish bank. It's Turkey's second largest state-owned public lender. And in 2019, the United States government found, or I might add, with the assistance of FDD's work, that this is the single largest violator of US sanctions on Iran. Right. And Halkbank, as a public lender, was involved directly with the Erdogan government, as well as members of his family and his Iranian counterparts, in channeling gold, Turkish gold, and purchasing illicitly Iranian gas and oil to the tune of $20 billion. And Halkbank was prosecuted at the Southern District of New York, which is the United States' premier court, federal court, that prosecutes bad state behavior in the world, illicit financing, terrorism. It is the premier venue where such cases are handled, right? And we secured a conviction saying, yes, that the Turkish State Bank, in conjunction with members of the Turkish government, including Erdogan, were involved in a brazen scheme that resulted in the biggest embezzlement of the US Treasury in memory. $20 billion of Iranian oil and gas paid for with with gold to escape US monitoring. Since that time, the Turks spent some considerable amount of energies trying to appeal that decision, resulting in a Supreme Court ruling that, ended all appeals. All we were waiting for was the sentencing of Halkbank and the incrimination of Turkish officials, including Erdogan. And unfortunately, after September 2025, Trump used his executive leverage to essentially waive and make this go away. I went out for a drink that day. What I'm saying is we already had wins. right? We could have held Turkey accountable. We were talking about fines against Halkbank to the tune of somewhere between 20 to 40 billion dollars of fines, which would have collapsed the bank. It would have held members of the Erdogan government, including Erdogan, accountable, right? This would have had ripples. It would have sent shockwaves across the Turkish economy and Turkey's political sort of incrimination in institutions like FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, and maintained Turkey's position on the grey list of terrorism and illicit financing supporting countries. We chose to walk away from this. But your larger question stands, why is Trump doing this? I have no idea. I seriously don't, because we share all of our findings related to Hamas, Turkey's sort of military buildup inside of Syria, Turkey's military footprint in African continent, Turkey's antagonization of European allies and partners such as Greece and Cyprus. And we try to show them the larger picture and saying, this is not a benign actor, and we don't essentially have, action being taken on this. I would argue there are people in the Trump administration, such as the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who very much understand what Turkey is. I would also argue that there are people in the national security establishment of the Trump administration who understand the threat that Turkey is. Why Trump personally does not understand and take action, again, I don't know.
Sinan, thank you so much for your time and expertise. I learned a lot from this conversation, and I'm sure that our audience will as well. How can people find your writings and everything that you're contributing?
No, thank you for having me. Easy. They can always follow me on X. It's just my first and last name, Sinan Ciddi. That's it. Anything at ftd.org is where we publish, and all of our analysis is uploaded, and they can always subscribe to that. But yeah, I would just say through our website and through my social media channels, we're always welcome to reach out and follow our work. Thank you for asking.
Amazing. Thank you, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you. Have a good day.